the mountain screamed. Not with the voice of stone or the groaning of tectonic plates shifting beneath the weight of ages, but with something far older and far more terrible. Mount Doom convulsed as if the world itself had been pierced, and from the depths of its molten heart, where no living thing had walked since the forging of the rings of power, a rift tore open. It was not fire that poured forth, though fire surrounded it. It was not shadow, though shadow fled from it. The air itself bent and fractured, reality folding like parchment held too close to flame, and through that impossible wound stepped a figure clad in armor the color of ancient rage. The Doomslayer emerged into Middle-earth as he had emerged into countless dimensions before. Silent, unyielding, and already moving forward. His boots struck volcanic glass and shattered it. The heat that would have reduced mortal flesh to ash in seconds rolled off the Praetor suit like water off steel. Behind him, the rift sealed, with a sound like a scream cut short, leaving only the eternal rumble of the mountain and the faint scent of something that did not belong, something that smelled of other worlds and older wars. The Slayer paused for only a moment, scanning the landscape with sensors built into a helmet that had witnessed the death of gods. Mordor stretched before him in all its desolation, plains of ash, towers of rusted iron, and in the distance, rising like a black talon to claw at the sky, Barad-dûr. He did not know this place. He did not need to. Where there was corruption, there was prey. The Slayer began to walk, and the mountain trembled beneath each step as though recognizing something it had never felt before, not conquest, not domination, but annihilation made manifest. High in the Tower of Sorcery, Sauron felt it. The Dark Lord's consciousness, vast and ancient, spread across Mordor like a web of iron and malice, felt the intrusion as a needle pressed against the eye. Something had entered his domain, something that did not bow, did not fear, did not even pause to acknowledge the weight of his will pressing down upon all living things within 100 leagues. Sauron's attention, which had been focused on the pathetic scurrying of the Fellowship, on the pitiful hope of men and elves, on the slow strangling of Gondor, now turned fully toward the source of this disturbance. What he saw made him pause. A single figure, walking through the ash plains. No army, no banner, no declaration of intent. Just one warrior, moving with the purposeful stride of something that had walked through fire before and would walk through it again. Sauron searched for the warrior's mind, seeking to crush it with fear or bend it with promises of power, but found nothing. Not resistance, not defiance, nothing. It was as if the figure's soul had been scraped clean of everything that could be touched, leaving only a core of something so dense and so hot that even Sauron's will skittered away from it like water on molten stone. Curious, Sauron thought, and sent the first wave. They came from the trenches and the iron pits, from the slave holds and the spawning vats. Orcs, dozens of them, then hundreds, pouring across the ash like a black tide. They howled as they ran, waving rusted scimitars and spiked clubs, their eyes gleaming with the particular cruelty that came from knowing they served something greater and more terrible than themselves. The Slayer did not slow. He reached over his shoulder and drew the super shotgun in a motion so smooth it seemed rehearsed by eternity itself. The first orc never saw the blast that erased its head and the three behind it. The Slayer moved forward through the spray of black blood, pumping the weapon once and fired again. Bone and armor shattered, bodies fell in pieces. He moved through them like a stone through water, each shot precise, economical, inevitable. An orc lunged from his left, blade aimed for the gap beneath his arm, and he caught it by the throat without looking, lifted it, and slammed it into the ground hard enough to crack the volcanic stone beneath. Another leaped for his back. He spun, and his armored fist caught it mid-air, caving in its ribcage with a sound like wet wood snapping. They kept coming, he kept killing. The super shotgun clicked empty. The Slayer holstered it and drew the combat shotgun in the same breath, firing in a steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Each pull of the trigger, each step forward, each body falling, formed a pattern that was almost musical in its precision. This was not battle. This was function. This was what he had been made for, remade for, rebuilt for, across dimensions and eons. An orc chieftain, larger than the others and clad in plates of black iron, charged with a roar that shook the air. The Slayer sidestepped, drove his fist through the creature's chest, and ripped its spine out through the front. The rest broke and ran. They did not get far. The Slayer's gauntlet-mounted flame belch ignited, and a wave of superheated plasma washed over the fleeing orcs, turning them into screaming torches that collapsed into the ash. He reloaded as he walked, stepping over and through the carnage without pause, his boots splashing in pools of black blood that steamed and hissed against the volcanic stone. Behind him, the bodies began to burn, not with normal fire, but with the residual argent energy that still clung to his armor, a greenish flame that consumed flesh and bone alike, leaving only smooth glass where corruption had been. In Barad-dûr, Sauron leaned forward on his throne. Interesting. Miles to the west, on the borders of Rohan, Gandalf the White stopped mid-sentence. He had been speaking with Theoden, discussing the mustering of the Rohirrim and the desperate mathematics of the coming war, when the air itself seemed to shudder. It was not a sound, not a vision, but a feeling, as if reality had been struck like a bell and was, still ringing with the impact. Gandalf's staff flared with light unbidden, and his eyes, which had seen the breaking of the world and the falling of stars, widened. "What is it?" Theoden asked, his weathered hand instinctively reaching for his sword. "Something has entered Mordor," Gandalf said slowly, his voice carrying a weight of uncertainty he rarely allowed others to hear. "Something that does not belong to this world or any world I have known. An ally? I do not know," Gandalf admitted, and that admission troubled him more than he cared to show. "But I feel no darkness in it. Only rage. Old rage. The kind that burns so hot it has consumed everything else." He closed his eyes and reached out with his power, trying to touch whatever had caused this disturbance, but his mind skittered away from it as if from a blade too sharp to grasp. All he could sense was motion, relentless and unyielding, carving a path through Mordor like a hot knife through wax. And beneath that, deeper, something that felt almost familiar, the echo of a purpose so absolute that it had transcended the being that carried it and become something else entirely. "We must know more," Gandalf said quietly. "If Sauron is threatened, that is to our advantage. If Sauron is joined by something worse, we are already lost." He turned without waiting for Theoden's response and strode from the hall, his staff striking the stone with sharp cracks that echoed like pronouncements of fate. The Slayer had crossed 5 miles of ash plain by the time the second wave arrived. This time, Sauron sent wargs. They came in a pack of 30 or more, massive wolves the size of horses, their riders clad in black mail and carrying long spears tipped with poison. They moved fast, far faster than the orcs, their coordination speaking to intelligence and experience. The lead rider raised his spear and screamed something in the black speech, a command or a challenge, and the pack spread out in a classic encirclement. Maneuver. The Slayer planted his feet and drew the heavy assault rifle. The first burst caught the lead warg in the throat and chest, the high-velocity rounds punching through fur and flesh and out the other side, painting the riders behind with arterial spray. The wolf collapsed mid-stride, its momentum sending it tumbling forward, crushing its rider beneath its bulk. The Slayer shifted his aim without pause, tracking the next target, compensating for speed and angle with the unconscious precision of something that had killed so many times that the act had become reflex. 2 more wargs fell. Then 5. Then the pack reached him. A warg leaped, jaws wide enough to swallow a man's head whole. The Slayer dropped the rifle, let it hang from its magnetic lock, and caught the creature's upper jaw with his left hand and lower jaw with his right. He pulled. The warg's skull came apart with a wet crunch, and he threw the pieces at the next attacker, the improvised projectile striking with enough force to shatter bone. A rider thrust his spear at the Slayer's throat. He caught the shaft mid-thrust, yanked the rider from his mount, and drove the spear through both rider and warg in a single motion. The battle became a whirlwind of violence. The Slayer moved through the pack like a scythe through wheat, his armor turning aside claws and teeth, his fists and weapons breaking bodies with mechanical efficiency. He seized a warg by its hind leg and swung it like a flail, using its body to batter two others to the ground before discarding it and moving forward. An orc rider stabbed him in the shoulder joint, the blade finding the gap in his armor, and he simply reached back, grabbed the orc by its face, and crushed its skull in his palm without breaking stride. The blood that ran down his armor was black and red and beginning to steam. Argent energy crackled along the Praetor suit's surface, a faint green glow that intensified with each kill. The suit was feeding, converting the violence into power, replenishing ammunition and energy reserves through processes that violated the laws of thermodynamics as Middle-earth understood them. The Slayer's movements became faster, harder, more precise. He was not tiring, he was accelerating. The last three wargs turned and fled. The Slayer drew the ballista, a shoulder-mounted energy weapon that crackled with barely contained power, and fired 3 times. The bolts crossed the distance in an instant, each one striking with enough force to vaporize wolf and rider alike, leaving only smoking craters in the ash. He lowered the weapon, scanned the horizon for additional threats, found none, and resumed his march toward the dark tower. Behind him, the field of corpses stretched for a quarter-mile, and the ash was turning to black glass beneath the residual heat. In Minas Tirith, Faramir stood on the highest wall and stared eastward. The sky above Mordor, which had been the same oppressive red-black for as long as anyone could remember, was flickering. Brief flashes of green light, like lightning but wrong, pulsed in the distance. They came at irregular intervals, each one accompanied by a faint tremor that could be felt even here, 60 leagues away. The guards were muttering among themselves, prayers and curses mixing with equal fervor. "What do you make of it?" asked one of his captains, a grizzled man who had seen 30 years of war and thought himself beyond surprise. "I make nothing of it," Faramir said honestly, "save that Mordor is troubled, and anything that troubles the enemy is worth watching." But even as he said it, he felt a doubt he could not name. The flashes of light did not feel like hope. They felt like something else, something that made the ancient stones of Minas Tirith hum with a frequency just beyond hearing. His father, Denethor, would have called it omen. His brother, Boromir, would have called it opportunity. Faramir called it nothing because he had no words for what he was feeling. But he did not leave the wall even as the sun set and the flashes continued through the darkness. In Lothlorien, Galadriel stood in her garden and felt the tremors in the fabric of the world. She had lived for ages beyond count, had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, had witnessed the forging of the rings and the corruption of those who wore them, but this was different. This was something that did not belong to the Song of Arda, to the music that had shaped the world at its beginning. It was a note played on an instrument from another symphony entirely, jarring and discordant, but undeniably powerful. She reached out with her mirror, filling it with water drawn from the silver spring, and gazed into its depths. What she saw made her draw back, her eternal composure cracking for just a moment. A figure clad in green and grey, walking through fire and shadow, leaving only destruction in its wake. But the destruction was clean, surgical, directed only at the corrupt and the twisted. Where it passed, Sauron's influence burned away like morning frost under sudden sun. "What are you?" she whispered to the vision, but the figure did not answer. It could not hear her. It existed in a space beyond words, beyond diplomacy, beyond anything but the pure execution of its purpose. She let the vision fade and stood in silence, considering. The enemy was being attacked from within, and not by any power of Middle-earth. That was good, that was necessary. But the cost of that attack, the nature of the thing that delivered it, troubled her in ways she could not articulate. It was too absolute, too final. It left no room for mercy or redemption or second chances. It simply erased. "May the Valar guide what has been unleashed," she said to the empty garden, and even she did not know if she meant it as prayer or warning. The Slayer reached the Black Gate at dawn. The great portal stood before him, wrought of iron and malice, its surface carved with images of torment and domination. 2 towers flanked it, each bristling with engines of war and crawling with orcs like ants on a corpse. The gate itself was closed, a barrier of black metal 40 feet high, and reinforced with sorcery that had stood unbreached for an age of the world. Before it stretched a killing field of obsidian and ash, designed to funnel attackers into range of the archers above and the pits below. The Slayer did not slow. Horns blared from the towers, harsh and discordant, and orcs boiled forth from murder holes and sallyports. Arrows fell like rain, hundreds of them, their tips glinting with poison. The Slayer activated the equipment launcher mid-stride and fired a frag grenade into the densest concentration of archers. The explosion painted the tower wall red and silenced half the arrows immediately. He fired again and again, each grenade placed with surgical precision to collapse archer nests and destroy siege equipment. The orcs on the ground reached him in a screaming wave. He met them with the chainsaw. The weapon roared to life with a sound that drowned out even the war horns, its tri-bladed teeth spinning fast enough to blur. The Slayer plunged it into the first rank of orcs and swept it sideways, and bodies came apart in a spray of meat and armor. The chainsaw was not a subtle weapon. It was not meant to be. It was a statement, a declaration that even in close quarters, even surrounded, even outnumbered 1,000 to 1, he was the only predator that mattered. He carved through them. Orcs fell in pieces, their weapons shattering against his armor or bouncing off the chainsaw's housing. Those who tried to flank him found his boots or fists waiting, each strike delivered with enough force to rupture organs and shatter spines. The suit's argent reserves spiked with each chainsaw kill, the weapon's unique properties converting biomass directly into ammunition and fuel. It was a closed loop of violence. Kill to move, move to kill, repeat until nothing remained. A troll emerged from the gate. 20 feet of muscle and rage wrapped in stone-hard hide, it bellowed and swung a club the size of a tree trunk. The Slayer sidestepped the blow, let the club crater the ground where he had been standing, and leaped. His jump carried him 15 feet straight up, augmented by the Praetor suit's servos, and he came down on the troll's shoulders. Before it could react, he drove the chainsaw down through the top of its skull and held on as the weapon chewed through bone and brain. The troll swayed, its eyes rolling back, and collapsed forward, carrying the Slayer with it. He rode it to the ground, pulled the chainsaw free, and stood atop the corpse. The orcs faltered. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. They had seen trolls fall before, but not like that, not so quickly. Not so completely. The Slayer dropped from the troll's back and began walking again, directly toward the black gate, the chainsaw still idling in his hands. The orcs parted before him, instinct overriding orders, and he passed through them like a stone through mist. He reached the gate and planted his feet. The chainsaw revved once, twice, and then he drove it into the iron. Sparks flew in a blinding cascade as the weapon bit into metal that had been forged with spells meant to resist battering rams and siege hammers. The Slayer leaned his weight into it, the Praetor suit's servos whining at maximum output, and the chainsaw's teeth ground deeper. Smoke poured from the wound in the gate, black and acrid, carrying the scent of burning metal and broken enchantments. The orcs behind him recovered from their shock and charged again, screaming. He did not turn around. Instead, he drew the rocket launcher with his free hand, aimed it over his shoulder without looking, and fired. The explosion deleted a dozen orcs and sent the rest sprawling. He fired again, then again, each rocket guided by the suit's targeting systems to maximize carnage and minimize waste. The chainsaw continued its work, chewing through layer after layer of ensorcelled iron, and the gate began to glow with heat. Cracks spread from the wound like lightning frozen in metal. The towers above poured arrows and stones and flaming pitch down on him, but the Praetor suit held, its energy shields flaring with each impact and regenerating faster than they could be depleted. With a sound like the world breaking, the gate split. The Slayer stepped back as the two halves fell inward, each one striking the ground with a boom that echoed across Mordor. He holstered the chainsaw, drew the super shotgun, and walked through the gap he had made. Behind him, the remaining orcs did not follow. They stood frozen, staring at the fallen gate, trying to process what they had just witnessed. By the time their courage returned, he was already gone, swallowed by the smoke and shadow of Mordor's interior. And in Barad-dûr, Sauron rose from his throne. The Dark Lord's form, rarely assumed in full, coalesced from shadow and flame. He was not as he had been in the days of his beauty, when he could walk among elves and deceive even the wise. He was armored now, clad in plates of black adamant, and wreathed in fire that burned without heat. His eyes, red and piercing, fixed on the direction of the broken gate. This was no longer curiosity. This was threat. "Gothmog," Sauron said, and his voice was the sound of stones grinding beneath glaciers. The lieutenant of Morgul stepped from the shadows, his form hunched and twisted, his breath a wet rasp behind his iron mask. "My lord, take the Nazgûl, take the reserves from the inner pits. Take the siege beasts from the breeding caverns. Bring me this creature's head, or do not return." "Yes, my lord." Gothmog departed, moving with surprising speed despite his deformities, and Sauron turned his attention inward. The one ring, worn on his finger, pulsed with power. Through it, he could feel the threads of dominion that bound every orc, every warg, every corrupted thing in his service. But when he reached toward the place where the intruder walked, he felt nothing. No thread, no connection. Not even the potential for connection. It was as if the creature was a void, a space where his power simply ceased to exist. For the first time in an age, Sauron felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since his master Morgoth had been cast into the void: uncertainty. The Slayer descended into the Iron Hills. The interior of Mordor was a maze of trenches, tunnels, and fortifications built over millennia of preparation for war. Orcs moved in columns, transporting supplies, dragging slaves, sharpening weapons. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of forge work and decay. The Slayer moved through it all like a ghost, his armor's camouflage systems bending light and sound around him, rendering him nearly invisible to eyes adapted to darkness. Nearly. An orc patrol, 4 strong, passed within 10 feet of him. The leader paused, sniffing the air, its piggish face wrinkling. It sensed something, smelled the faint ozone scent of argent energy. But before it could raise an alarm, the Slayer was among them. His blade, forged from the bones of demons and etched with runes that predated written language, slid through the leader's throat and out the back of its neck. He caught the body before it could fall, lowered it silently, and moved to the next. 4 kills in 4 seconds, each one executed with the cold efficiency of a machine, and then he was moving again, leaving the bodies arranged in a way that would not be noticed until the next patrol passed. He needed information. The UAC had trained him, in the time before Hell, to think tactically. The Seraphim had rebuilt him with purpose, but not stripped away that training. He was rage incarnate, but rage with intelligence, rage with patience. He could feel the presence of the central power in this place, the dark will that animated the central corruption. But he did not yet understand its nature. In Hell, he had learned to identify hierarchy, to strike at the source rather than exhaust himself on endless waves of lesser demons. Here, the principle was the same. Find the head, kill it, watch the body die. He found a command post carved into the side of a slag heap. Orc overseers barked orders at slave gangs, hauling carts of weapons toward the front. The Slayer waited until the overseers were isolated, then moved. He took the first from behind, snapping its neck with a twist that barely made a sound. The second turned at the noise and died with the blade through its eye. The third managed a half scream before he crushed its windpipe with his thumb. He dragged the bodies into the shadows and searched them, finding maps drawn on crude parchment and orders written in a language he could not read but recognized as organized, military, purposeful. He studied the maps. They showed Mordor's layout in surprising detail: troop, concentrations, supply depots, fortifications. And at the center, dominating everything else, a single structure marked with a symbol that even without translation clearly meant power. Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, the head of the serpent. The Slayer folded the map and placed it in a storage compartment on his armor. He would go there, but first he would weaken it. He spent the next 6 hours destroying. Supply depots erupted in flames as he planted thermite charges and walked away without looking back. Weapons caches exploded when he overloaded their stored argent energy, converting them into improvised bombs. Orc barracks collapsed as he severed support beams with precision cuts from his blade. He moved through the industrial heart of Mordor like a cancer, invisible and unstoppable, and everywhere he passed, things fell apart. A forge complex, massive enough to arm 10,000 orcs, went up in a fireball that could be seen from the walls of Minas Tirith. The Slayer had found its central furnace, a pit of molten metal fed by volcanic channels, and simply removed the containment wards. The resulting explosion vaporized everything within 100 yards and sent shockwaves that collapsed tunnels for miles in every direction. A breeding pit, where Sauron's servants grew new horrors in vats of corruption, burned when the Slayer introduced a chemical compound synthesized from his suit's medical systems. The compound reacted with the organic slurry, producing a fire that could not be extinguished by water or smothering, only by complete consumption. The screams of the things dying in their gestation chambers echoed through the tunnels for hours. An armory storing weapons meant for the assault on Gondor simply ceased to exist when the Slayer planted a series of precisely calibrated charges along its support columns. The structure folded in on itself with mathematical precision, and when the dust cleared, there was only a crater where 10,000 spears, swords, and siege engines had been stored. But he was not invisible to everything. High above, riding the thermals on wings of shadow and terror, the Nazgûl circled. The Ringwraiths, greatest of Sauron's servants, felt the disturbance as a wound in the fabric of their master's dominion. They could not see the Slayer directly, not with eyes, but they sensed his presence the way a blind man might sense the sun, as heat, as pressure, as wrongness. Their mounts, fell beasts bred from ancient reptilian stock and twisted by sorcery, screamed their hunger as they descended. The Slayer was crossing an open plaza, a rare mistake born from urgency, when the first Nazgûl struck. The fell beast came down like a meteor, claws extended, its rider's blade already swinging for the Slayer's head. He rolled forward, the blade passing through the space where his neck had been, and came up firing. The ballista bolt caught the fell beast in the chest and punched through, the energy discharge cooking its heart in an instant. The creature crashed and slid, its momentum carrying it past him, and the Nazgûl rider tumbled free. It rose immediately, unhurt, its form billowing with shadow despite the daylight filtering through Mordor's perpetual haze. The Slayer and the Ringwraith faced each other across 20 feet of scorched stone. The Nazgûl spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers and screams layered atop each other. "You are nothing. You are dust. You will kneel, or you will be unmade." The Slayer said nothing. He never did. The Ringwraith raised its blade, a weapon forged in darkness and quenched in the blood of kings, and charged. It moved with inhuman speed, faster than any orc or troll. Its strikes aimed not at flesh, but at the soul beneath. The blade could kill with a touch, could drain life and will, and leave only a husk. But when it struck the Slayer's armor, it rebounded with a clang that sounded wrong, discordant, as if reality itself rejected the contact. The Slayer caught the next strike on his vambrace, twisted, and drove his fist into the Nazgûl's chest. The impact would have shattered stone. The Ringwraith staggered but did not fall, its form already healing, shadow knitting back together where the blow had dispersed it. The Slayer followed with a knee strike, then an elbow, each blow delivered with mechanical precision, but the Nazgûl would not stay down. It was already dead. Pain meant nothing. Physical damage meant nothing. Only the destruction of its master or the recovery of its ring could truly end it. The Slayer understood. He switched tactics. He drew the plasma rifle and opened fire at point-blank range. The superheated bolts of energy punched through the ringwraith's form, each one dispersing more shadow, more cohesion. The Nazgul shrieked, a sound that shattered windows in buildings 100 yards away, and tried to retreat into its native ethereal state. But the Argent-enhanced plasma prevented that, the energy interfering with whatever laws allowed the creature to exist between life and death. The Slayer advanced, firing continuously, and the ringwraith began to come apart. The other 8 Nazgul arrived. They descended from all sides, fell beasts screaming, blades gleaming with unlight. The Slayer holstered the plasma rifle and drew the BFG. The weapon, massive and glowing with barely contained power, hummed as it charged. The Nazgul, sensing something they could not name but instinctively feared, tried to pull up to abort their attack, but momentum carried them forward. The Slayer fired, and the plaza turned green. The BFG's discharge was not a bullet or a bolt. It was a sphere of condensed argent energy that distorted space around it, tendrils of green lightning lashing out to strike anything living within a 50-foot radius. The Nazgul and their mounts were caught in the blast, and for the first time in millennia, they felt pain, true pain, the kind that reached past their undead shells and burned the remnants of their souls. Their fell beasts simply vaporized, reduced to constituent atoms in an instant. The ringwraiths themselves were thrown backward, their forms disrupted so completely that they dispersed into smoke and were blown away on winds that suddenly howled from nowhere. The Slayer stood in the center of the blast crater, the BFG cooling in his hands, and scanned for additional targets. There were none. The plaza was empty, save for the residue of argent fire and the slowly settling ash. He reloaded and continued toward the tower. Far to the west, Gandalf and Aragorn stood on a ridge overlooking the plains of Gorgoroth. They had ridden hard from Rohan, taking only the swiftest horses and leaving the army to follow. Gandalf had insisted, driven by a certainty he could not explain, that they needed to see whatever was happening in Mordor with their own eyes. Now, watching from a distance, they saw the green flash that lit the sky like a false dawn, and they felt the tremor that followed. "That was no work of Sauron," Aragorn said quietly, his hand on the hilt of Andúril. "No," Gandalf agreed. "Sauron's power is red and black, fire and shadow. This is something else. Something colder, more absolute. Could it be one of the Valar? Have they finally intervened?" Gandalf shook his head slowly. "I do not think the Valar would intervene thus. They forswore direct action in Middle-earth after the breaking of Beleriand. And even if they had changed their minds, this does not feel like their work. It feels like wrath, Aragorn. Pure wrath, without mercy or compromise." "Then what is it?" "A weapon," Gandalf said after a long pause. "Or something that has been made into a weapon so completely that nothing else remains." They watched in silence as more flashes lit the distant sky. Smaller now, scattered across the black landscape of Mordor like stars fallen to earth and burning still. "Should we approach?" Aragorn asked. "Try to make contact?" "I think," Gandalf said slowly, "that would be very unwise. Whatever this is, it does not discriminate. It sees only corruption and destroys it. If we entered its path, even with the best intentions, I'm not certain it would recognize us as different from the enemy's servants." "You speak as if it is mindless." "Not mindless," Gandalf corrected. "Single-minded. There is a difference. A river is not mindless, but it flows only downhill. A fire is not mindless, but it burns only what is fuel. This thing, whatever it is, has been shaped to a single purpose so completely that it may have forgotten there was ever anything else." In the Fellowship's camp, leagues to the south, Frodo woke screaming. Sam was at his side immediately, shaking him gently. "Mr. Frodo, what is it? Another dream?" But Frodo could not speak. He clutched at the ring hanging around his neck, and his eyes were wide with an emotion Sam could not name. Not fear, exactly, not pain. Something closer to confusion, as if the ring itself did not understand what it was feeling. The ring had consciousness, of a sort. It was an extension of Sauron's will, designed to call to its master and to corrupt those who bore it. But now, for the first time since its forging, it felt something it had not been designed to feel. Uncertainty. There was a presence in Mordor, something that moved through its master's domain like a blade through flesh, and the ring could not touch it, could not influence it, could not even perceive it clearly. It was a blank space, a void where the ring's awareness simply ended. And worse, the ring could feel its master's attention wavering, turning away from the hunt for the ring itself to focus on this new threat. For the first time in long ages, Frodo felt the weight of the ring's influence lessen, just slightly, like a hand relaxing its grip on his throat. "It's troubled," Frodo whispered finally, his voice hoarse. "The ring is troubled. Something is happening that it does not understand." "Is that good?" Sam asked, hopefully. "I don't know," Frodo admitted. "I think it might be, but I also think it might be something terrible in a different way." He did not elaborate. And Sam did not press him. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the camp and feeling, without understanding, that the world was changing in ways that had nothing to do with their quest. The Slayer encountered Gothmog's force 3 miles from Barad-dûr. The Orc lieutenant had assembled the finest warriors in Mordor, armored Uruks bearing tower shields and long pikes, berserkers with 2-handed axes, crossbowmen with steel-tipped bolts capable of punching through plate armor. Behind them came the siege beasts, creatures bred specifically for breaking fortifications. Massive trolls fitted with armor, plating, and carrying rams, cave drakes that breathed fire and poison, and things that had no name in the common tongue, amalgamations of flesh and metal and hate. Gothmog stood at the center of his force, recognizable by his size and the elaborate armor that marked his rank. He raised his sword as the Slayer came into view, walking alone across the ash plain, and bellowed a command in the black speech. The army charged. The Slayer stopped walking and assessed the situation with the cold calculation of something that had faced worse odds and survived. The conventional approach would be to retreat, to break line of sight, to use terrain and tactics to avoid being overwhelmed. But the Slayer had learned long ago that retreat was simply a different word for delay, and delay meant the enemy had time to prepare, to reinforce, to adapt. He drew the rocket launcher and fired into the center of the charging mass. The explosion deleted a dozen Uruks and created a crater that the next rank had to navigate around, disrupting the charge's momentum. He fired again, and again, each rocket placed to maximize disruption and create choke points in the enemy formation. The crossbowmen opened fire, and bolts whistled through the air. The Slayer's shields took most of them, the few that penetrated glancing off his armor. He holstered the rocket launcher and drew the chain gun. The weapon spun up with a whine that rose to a shriek, and then he opened fire. The chain gun was designed for sustained suppression, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute with minimal recoil thanks to the Praetor suit's stabilization systems. The Slayer walked forward into the charging army, the weapon's barrels glowing red-hot, and orcs fell in windrows. The armored Uruks raised their shields, and the rounds punched through them and the orcs behind them. The berserkers tried to close the distance, and he swept the chain gun across them in a horizontal arc that cut them off at the knees. A siege beast, one of the armored trolls, loomed before him. The Slayer released the chain gun's trigger, let momentum carry him forward, and leaped. He came down on the troll's shoulders, drew his blade, and drove it down through the gap between helmet and chest plate. The troll staggered, blood fountaining from the wound, and he rode it to the ground, using its collapse as cover while he reloaded. A cave drake reared up, its throat glowing with building fire, and he fired the ballista into its open mouth. The bolt traveled down its throat and detonated somewhere in its chest cavity, and the drake exploded from the inside out, showering the battlefield with burning viscera. The Slayer kept moving, kept killing, and the army began to break. These were not the poorly trained orcs of the outer defenses. These were veterans, the elite, warriors who had fought in dozens of campaigns and never broken. But they had never faced anything like this. Every tactic they tried failed. Surround him, and he simply killed in all directions. Concentrate fire, and his shields held or he used their own dead as cover. Send in the heavy units, and he dismantled them with the same cold efficiency he showed everything. Gothmog, watching from a rise, felt something he had not felt in his long service to the Dark Lord: doubt. He had been told to bring back this creature's head, but as he watched his army being systematically destroyed, he began to wonder if that was even possible. The creature did not fight like a warrior. It fought like a natural disaster, impersonal and unstoppable. He made a decision. If he could not kill it, he would at least slow it down long enough for his master to prepare. Gothmog raised his sword and screamed a command. The reserve forces, held back for exactly this purpose, surged forward. Not to attack the creature directly, but to collapse the tunnels and trenches around it, to bury it under tons of stone and earth. Demolition teams rushed forward with kegs of blasting powder, and within seconds, the ground beneath the Slayer's feet began to shake. The Slayer felt the vibration, recognized what it meant, and ran. He moved faster than should have been possible for something wearing that much armor, the Praetor suit's servos amplifying every stride. Behind him, the ground collapsed in stages, massive sinkholes opening up as the support structures failed. Orcs who were too slow to escape fell screaming into the darkness. The siege beasts, too large and ponderous to escape, were swallowed whole. The Slayer leaped from collapsing ledge to collapsing ledge, each jump covering impossible distances until he reached solid ground. He turned and surveyed the damage. A quarter-mile section of Mordor's interior had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a jagged chasm that still smoked with disturbed volcanic gases. Gothmog's army was cut in half, those who had escaped the collapse now separated from their commander by an impassable gap. The Slayer looked across the chasm and found Gothmog staring back at him. For a long moment they regarded each other. Then Gothmog did something unexpected. He saluted, raising his sword in acknowledgement of a worthy foe, and turned to retreat toward Barad-dûr. The Slayer did not return the salute. He simply marked Gothmog's position, calculated a route around the chasm, and began moving again. The retreat had bought time, but time was all it had bought. The outcome had never been in question. Night fell as the Slayer circled the chasm, and Mordor's darkness deepened. The few stars that could penetrate the perpetual haze vanished entirely, and the only light came from the fires that still burned across the landscape and the distant red glow of Mount Doom. The Slayer's helmet switched to thermal imaging automatically, painting the world in shades of heat and cold. He found the bridge 2 hours later. It was ancient, a span of stone that predated even Sauron's occupation of Mordor, carved with runes in a language that not even the Dark Lord could fully read. It crossed the chasm at its narrowest point, a natural choke point that any defender would fortify. And fortified it was. Guard towers rose on both sides, and the bridge itself was crowded with orcs, trolls, and improvised barricades. The Slayer did not slow. He drew the BFG as he approached, and the orcs on the bridge saw the weapon begin to glow. They knew, instinctively, what was coming, and they ran. But the bridge was crowded, and there was nowhere to go. The Slayer fired, and the BFG's sphere carved a path of annihilation straight down the center of the span. Everything it touched simply ceased to exist. Everything within 15 feet of it died as tendrils of argent energy boiled flesh and shattered bone. The bridge, unsupported by the bodies that had been standing on it, began to crack. The Slayer ran, racing the structural failure, his boots pounding against stone that was already beginning to fall away. Behind him, the bridge collapsed in sections, each one falling into the chasm with a boom that echoed like thunder. He reached the far side with seconds to spare, leaped the final gap as the last section fell, and rolled. To his feet on solid ground, he stood, dusted himself off with a gesture that was almost casual, and looked up at Barad-dûr. It was close now, less than a mile. He could see the individual stones of its construction, each one the size of a house. He could see the windows, if they could be called that, openings in the stone that glowed with red fire. He could feel the weight of the will that animated it, pressing down on the world like a physical presence. He began to walk, and with each step, the tower seemed to grow larger, darker, more absolute. It filled the sky, blotting out what little light remained, and the Slayer walked toward it as he had walked toward every fortress, every stronghold, every seat of power he had encountered across countless dimensions. He walked toward it to tear it down. The Slayer reached the base of Barad-dûr as night gave way to the false dawn of Mordor's perpetual twilight. The dark tower rose before him, a spike of obsidian and malice that seemed to pierce the sky itself. Its foundations were sunk deep into the bones of the earth, and its height was such that clouds broke against its flanks and fell as black rain. The gates at its base were graven with runes that hurt to look upon, wards and curses layered over millennia to keep out armies and angels alike. The Slayer stood before them and felt, for the first time since entering this world, something like recognition. This was a place of power, real power. Not the crude dominion of Hell's barons or the thoughtless hunger of its demons, but something older and more deliberate. Corruption given purpose, malice given form. It reminded him, in some distant way, of the Makers, beings who had taken divinity and bent it toward control. He hated it immediately. The gates opened before he could act, grinding inward on hinges the size of houses. Beyond them, a passage stretched into darkness so complete that even his helmet's enhanced vision struggled to penetrate it. The Slayer did not hesitate. He walked forward, and the gates ground shut behind him with a finality that would have been ominous to anyone capable of fear. Inside, the tower was a labyrinth. Corridors branched and twisted, spiraling upward and downward simultaneously, defying geometry and reason. The walls were alive with whispers, promises of power, and threats of destruction layered atop each other until they became white noise. Orcs and other things moved in the shadows, always just out of sight, their eyes reflecting red in the darkness. The Slayer ignored them. He could feel the source of the corruption now, a presence that pressed down from above like a physical weight. He followed that feeling, moving through the maze with single-minded determination, breaking through locked doors and sealed passages when they blocked his path. He ascended. The tower fought him. Floors collapsed beneath his feet, dropping him into pits filled with spikes and worse things. He climbed out. Walls shifted, trying to crush him or seal him in. He punched through them. Enchantments designed to drain strength, or will or life itself, flickered against his armor and failed, unable to find purchase on something that had already been stripped of everything but purpose. A chamber opened before him, vast and circular, its walls lined with chains and implements of torture. Hanging from those chains were the remains of those who had defied Sauron. Elves, men, dwarves, their bodies preserved by dark sorcery to serve as eternal warnings. The Slayer paused, scanned the room, and found what he was looking for, another passage, hidden behind a false wall. He was about to proceed when the bodies began to move. They were not alive. They could not be. But Sauron's will animated them still, puppeting the corpses in a grotesque mockery of life. They pulled themselves free of their chains with movements that were all wrong, joints bending in impossible directions, and lurched toward him. The Slayer drew the plasma rifle and began firing. The superheated bolts punched through desiccated flesh, flash burning it to ash, and the corpses fell. But more kept coming, pulled from alcoves and cells throughout the chamber, a tide of the dead sent to overwhelm him. He switched to the flame belch, bathing the room in fire. The corpses burned eagerly, their preserved flesh catching like tinder, and within seconds the chamber was an inferno. The Slayer walked through it, his armor's thermal shielding protecting him from heat that would have melted steel, and reached the hidden passage. He punched through the false wall and continued upward, leaving the burning dead behind. The climb took hours. The tower was impossibly vast, its interior containing more space than its exterior should have allowed. Sauron had bent the laws of reality in its construction, creating a structure that existed partially in the physical world and partially in the realm of shadow. But the Slayer had walked through folded dimensions before. He understood, instinctively, how to navigate them. When a corridor looped back on itself, he found the seam where it connected and forced his way through. When a staircase led nowhere, he broke through the ceiling and made his own path. He encountered resistance at every turn. Orcs in ambush, trolls blocking passages, enchanted guardians made of stone and shadow. He killed them all. The tower's defenders grew more desperate as he climbed higher, throwing everything they had at him in waves that would have drowned an army. But the Slayer was not an army. He was a single point of absolute lethality, and everything that stood in his path died. After an hour, he reached the throne room. It was vast beyond reason, a chamber that should not have fit inside the tower's dimensions but did anyway. The floor was polished obsidian that reflected a sky that was not there, full of dying stars and empty void. The walls rose into shadow, and the ceiling, if there was one, was lost beyond sight. At the far end, perhaps 100 yards distant, stood a throne of black iron and old bones, and upon it sat a figure wreathed in fire. Sauron the Great, the Dark Lord, the enemy of the free peoples, looked upon the Doomslayer and saw his doom. "You dare," Sauron said, his voice rolling across the chamber like thunder before a storm. "You dare enter my sanctum. You dare stand before me. You, who are nothing but flesh wrapped in borrowed metal." The Slayer said nothing. He began to walk forward. "I am the Ringmaker, the deceiver of the wise. I have commanded legions. I have broken kingdoms. I have outlasted ages. What are you?" The Slayer continued forward, his pace steady, his weapons ready. Sauron rose from his throne, and the chamber shook. "You will kneel, creature. You will serve. Or you will be unmade so completely that not even memory will remain." The Slayer stopped, finally, at the base of the dais. He looked up at the Dark Lord, and though his face was hidden behind his revest helmet, Sauron felt the weight of that gaze like a physical blow. He saw, in that moment, what the Slayer was beneath the armor. Not a man, not anymore, but something that had been refined by endless war into a single perfect edge, rage without end, vengeance without limit, a force of nature given hands to kill with. Sauron raised his hand, and fire poured forth. It was not normal flame. It was the fire of dominion, the heat that had forged the One Ring and bound the wills of nations. It struck the Slayer in a column 20 feet wide, hot enough to melt stone, bright enough to blind. It washed over him, around him, and he walked through it. The Praetor suit's energy shields flared, holding, converting the thermal energy into power for his weapons. He emerged from the flames unharmed, his armor glowing white-hot but intact, and fired the ballista. The bolt struck Sauron in the chest and exploded. The Dark Lord staggered, more from surprise than damage, and the fire cut off. He looked down at the scorched mark on his armor, then back at the Slayer, and for the first time in ages, he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "So, you have teeth," Sauron gestured, and the throne room filled with orcs. They poured from hidden doors and passages, thousands of them, the elite guard of Barad-dûr, each one armed and armored beyond the standard grunt. They formed a living wall between the Slayer and their master, and Sauron stepped back, ascending into the shadows. "Prove yourself worthy," the Dark Lord commanded. "Survive, and we will speak again. Die, and you will join the countless others who thought themselves strong enough to challenge me." The first wave of orcs charged, and the Slayer met them with the chainsaw. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Slayer cut through the orcs like a storm through wheat, his weapons never stopping, never missing, never running dry. The chainsaw carved paths through packed ranks. The super shotgun deleted entire groups with each trigger pull. The rocket launcher painted the walls red and black. He moved constantly, never remaining in one place long enough to be surrounded, always pushing forward, always killing. The orcs died by the dozens, then the hundreds. Those who tried to flee found their escape blocked by their own comrades. Those who stood and fought lasted seconds longer at best. The Slayer was relentless, tireless, pitiless. Each kill fed the next, argent energy flowing through the suit systems, maintaining peak efficiency no matter how long the slaughter lasted. 10 minutes in, the survivors broke and ran, abandoning their posts and their master's commands in favor of simple survival. The Slayer let them go. They were not the target. He turned his attention upward, to where Sauron watched from a balcony of shadow. "Impressive," the Dark Lord said, and his voice carried a note of genuine respect. "You are no mere mortal, but neither are you divine. What are you?" The Slayer fired. "The BFG." The green sphere streaked across the chamber, tendrils already lashing out, and struck the balcony dead center. The explosion lit the throne room like a sun, and the shockwave blew out every window in the tower's upper levels. Sauron's form dispersed in the blast, reduced to smoke and malice, but even as it did, it began to reform. Piece by piece, the Dark Lord pulled himself back together, drawing on the power of the One Ring and the foundations of his fortress. He reappeared on the throne, fully intact, and laughed. The sound was horrible, devoid of humor, filled with cruel triumph. "You cannot kill me, little warrior. I am beyond death, beyond defeat. I am idea made flesh, dominion given form. Destroy this body, and I will build another. Destroy this tower, and I will rise elsewhere. I am eternal." The Slayer holstered his weapons and began to climb. Sauron's laughter cut off. The Slayer ascended the dais, not running, not charging, but walking with the same deliberate pace he had maintained since entering the tower. Sauron raised his hand again, and this time the fire that poured forth was black, threaded with whispers and screams, the concentrated essence of despair. It wrapped around the Slayer like chains, seeking to break his will, to crush his spirit, to make him kneel. He did not kneel. He took one step, then another, pushing through the flames, his armor scorching but holding. Each step was an act of defiance, a declaration that will alone could not stop him, that fear was a weapon that had been burned out of him long ago. He reached the throne, and Sauron, for the first time, took a step back. The Slayer seized him by the throat. Sauron struck out, his fists wreathed in sorcerous power, each blow carrying force enough to shatter steel. They rained down on the Slayer's helmet, his shoulders, his chest, and the armor held. The Slayer tightened his grip, and Sauron felt something he had not felt in millennia, his physical form beginning to fail. Not dispersing, not transforming, but truly failing, the power that held it together being physically torn apart. "Impossible," Sauron hissed, his voice losing its thunder, becoming almost mortal. "You are nothing. You are beneath me. You cannot." The Slayer lifted him off the ground, and Sauron's words became choked gasps. The Dark Lord's power lashed out in desperation, raw and unfocused. The throne room shook. The floor cracked. Reality itself seemed to bend under the strain of Sauron's will, trying to assert itself against something that simply refused to acknowledge it. The one ring on his finger blazed with light, red and terrible, but even that ancient artifact could not save its master. The Slayer's grip was absolute. Sauron tried to disperse, to abandon his physical form and retreat into pure spirit, but the Slayer's armored fist somehow prevented even that. The argent energy that powered the Praetor suit interfered with the metaphysical laws that allowed Sauron to exist in multiple states at once. For the first time since the forging of the ring, Sauron was trapped, fully and completely, in a single form. And that form was dying. The Slayer ripped Sauron's head from his shoulders. The Dark Lord's body erupted in black fire and shadow, dissolving even as it fell, but the Slayer did not let go of the head. He could feel the presence within it, the consciousness trying to flee back into the One Ring, and he squeezed. The skull cracked, then shattered, and the fire that burst from it was not black but red, hot and pure, the last scream of something ancient finally meeting its end. The One Ring fell from Sauron's dissolving finger and struck the floor with a clear, bell-like tone. It lay there, gleaming in the firelight, still intact, still powerful. The Slayer looked down at it, and the ring, sensing his attention, pulsed once. It tried to reach into his mind, to plant the seeds of desire and corruption, to begin its eternal work of domination. But when it touched the Slayer's consciousness, it found nothing to corrupt. No desire for power, no ambition, no fear of death or hope for glory. Only purpose, burning so hot that everything else had been consumed. The ring recoiled. The Slayer bent down and picked it up. It felt warm in his palm, alive in a way that made his skin crawl even through the armor. He could sense the malice in it, the concentrated evil of ages, and he understood instinctively what it was: a phylactery, a container for a soul too corrupt to die naturally. He had encountered such things before, in hell and in other dimensions. He knew what had to be done. The tower screamed with Sauron's death, cracks racing up its walls. The foundations that had stood for ages suddenly fragile without the will that had sustained them. The Slayer turned and walked toward the exit as the throne room began to collapse around him. Blocks of stone the size of houses fell from above, and he wove between them without hurrying. The floor split open, revealing chasms that dropped into darkness, and he leaped across them with the suit's augmented strength. Behind him, the throne exploded in a pillar of fire that reached the ceiling and kept climbing. He reached the corridor and began to descend, the ring still clutched in his fist. The tower fought him still, its death throes violent and indiscriminate. Walls collapsed, ceilings caved in, floors gave way. The Slayer moved through it all with the same mechanical efficiency he had shown in battle, each step calculated, each movement precise. Orcs and other creatures, driven mad by the tower's destruction and their master's death, threw themselves at him in suicidal waves, and he killed them without breaking stride. He emerged from the base of the tower as it began to fall. Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, the symbol of Sauron's power and the anchor of his will, collapsed inward. It did not topple. It imploded, crushing itself under its own impossible weight, sinking into the earth as if the world itself could no longer bear its presence. The sound was like the ending of all things, a roar that echoed across Mordor and beyond, reaching even to the walls of Minas Tirith and the forests of Lothlorien. The Slayer stood in the ash plain and watched it fall. When the last stone had settled and the dust had begun to clear, he looked down at the ring in his hand. It pulsed again, weaker now without its master, but still potent, still dangerous. He could feel it trying to speak to him, to bargain, to promise him dominion over all he surveyed. He walked toward Mount Doom. The journey took 3 hours, cutting across the devastated landscape of Mordor. The fires he had started burned everywhere now, consuming the infrastructure of Sauron's war machine. Forges collapsed, slave pens emptied as their wards failed. Orcs fought each other in the streets or fled into the wasteland. Without the Dark Lord's will to bind them, without the promise of victory to sustain them, the army of Mordor tore itself apart. The Slayer ignored it all. He had a task to complete. He reached the Samath Nar, the chambers of fire, where the ring had been forged. The path up the mountain was treacherous, carved into volcanic stone, and battered by winds that carried ash and embers. He climbed steadily, the ring growing heavier in his hand with each step, as if it sensed its doom approaching and was trying to resist through sheer mass. At the summit, he stood at the edge of the pit where the ring had been born. Below, the magma churned and bubbled, the heart of the mountain laid bare. The ring burned in his palm now, actually burning, its power leaking out in desperation. The Slayer raised his fist over the pit, and then he paused, not from hesitation, not from doubt, but because he felt something, a presence watching him from across vast distance. He turned, scanning the horizon, and saw a figure standing on a ridge miles away. It was tall, clad in white, and it carried a staff. The figure raised one hand, not in greeting or farewell, but in acknowledgement. The Slayer stared for a moment, then turned back to the pit. He opened his fist, and the one ring fell. It tumbled through the air, catching the light of the fires below, and splashed into the magma. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the mountain shook. The ring was being unmade, its power unraveling, the binding spells that held it together burning away. The explosion that followed was not physical but metaphysical, a shockwave of released power that swept across Middle-earth like a silent storm. In Minas Tirith, Faramir felt it as a weight lifting from his shoulders, a pressure he had carried all his life suddenly gone. In Lothlorien, Galadriel closed her eyes and wept with relief. In the Fellowship's camp, Frodo collapsed as the chain around his neck fell away, empty, the ring it had carried no longer in this world or any other. And in Mordor, the last remnants of Sauron's power guttered and died like candles in a hurricane. The Slayer descended the mountain and began walking toward the Black Gate. Behind him, Mount Doom erupted, not with violence but with cleansing fire, as if the mountain itself was celebrating its freedom from the corruption that had been built upon it. The sky above Mordor, which had been choked with smoke and ash for centuries, began to clear. Sunlight, true sunlight, touched the land for the first time in living memory. The Slayer reached the ruins of the Black Gate and stopped. The rift was opening before him, a tear in reality identical to the one that had brought him here. Through it, he could see fire and stone, the familiar landscape of hell or some other contested dimension. He stepped toward it without hesitation, but before he could step through, a voice called out behind him, "Wait." The Slayer turned. Gandalf stood 50 paces away, leaning heavily on his staff, breathing hard from the effort of catching up. Aragorn was with him and several rangers, all staring at the armored figure with expressions that mixed awe and uncertainty. "We would speak with you," Gandalf said, taking a step forward. "We would know what you are, why you came, and whether you intend to return." The Slayer stared at them in silence. His helmet betrayed no expression, no hint of thought or emotion. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind carrying ash across the devastated plain. Then he turned away and stepped through the rift. It sealed behind him with a sound like a door closing, and he was gone. Gandalf and Aragorn stood in silence, staring at the space where the rift had been. Around them, Mordor burned with cleansing fire, and in the distance they could hear the sounds of orcs fleeing or fighting each other as their civilization collapsed without purpose or direction. "Was it divine?" Aragorn asked quietly. "I do not know," Gandalf admitted. "I have lived long, and I have seen many things, but I have never seen 24s, anything like that. It had the power of the Valar, but not their nature. It had the fury of the Eldar at their height, but not their wisdom. It was something else entirely. A weapon, as I said before, but made by whom, and for what purpose beyond the destruction of evil, I cannot say. Should we fear its return?" Gandalf considered this. "I do not think it will return. I think it came because there was a door opened, a way between worlds, and it simply walked through because that is what it does. It moves from world to world, dimension to dimension, destroying corruption wherever it finds it. And when its work is done, it moves on. Then we are fortunate it found only Sauron and not us." "Yes," Gandalf said softly, "though I wonder if luck had anything to do with it. I think, perhaps, it can tell the difference between corruption and innocence, or perhaps it simply knows which battles are worth fighting. Either way, we should be grateful it considered Sauron an enemy, and not us." They turned and began the long walk back toward the lands of the free peoples, leaving Mordor to its fires and its collapse. Behind them, unnoticed, a piece of the Slayer's armor lay half buried in the ash. It was green, scorched, and etched with runes that no scholar of Middle-earth would ever decipher. In time, it would be found and kept as a relic, a reminder of the day something from beyond the circles of the world had passed through and changed everything. In Minas Tirith, the bells rang. No one knew quite why they started, but once the first bell rang, others joined in, and soon the entire city was alive with sound. People poured into the streets, looking east toward Mordor, and they saw the smoke beginning to clear. They saw the darkness lifting. They felt, in their bones, that something fundamental had changed. The war was over, not because of a great battle, not because of a heroic sacrifice, but because something had simply walked into the enemy's stronghold and torn it apart from the inside. The people did not know how, they did not know why, but they knew it was done, and they celebrated. In the days that followed, messengers returned from Mordor with reports that seemed too fantastical to believe. The Dark Tower had fallen, Sauron was destroyed, the One Ring had been unmade. The Orc armies had collapsed into civil war or fled into the wilderness. Gondor was saved, not by its own strength, but by something that had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Aragorn was crowned king, as had been foretold, and he ruled with wisdom and justice. But in quiet moments, when he sat alone in the throne room, he would sometimes think about the armored figure that had walked through fire and shadow without speaking, without hesitating, without asking for anything in return. He wondered what drove such a being, what kept it moving forward when everything else had been burned away. And he decided, finally, that some questions were better left unanswered. Gandalf sailed west, as was always his destiny. But before he left, he wrote down everything he had seen and felt that day. He sealed the account in a vault in Minas Tirith with instructions that it should only be opened if something similar ever appeared again. He did not think it would, but he believed in being prepared. Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin returned to the Shire and found it much as they had left it, untouched by the war that had consumed the rest of Middle-earth. They settled back into their lives, and while they sometimes spoke of their adventures, they never mentioned the strange tremors they had felt, the green lights in the distance, or the way Frodo's burden had suddenly lifted in a moment that had nothing to do with their quest. Some things, they decided, were better left to mystery. Years passed. A generation. 2. The story of Sauron's defeat became legend, and the legend became myth. The details changed with each telling. Some said the Valar themselves had intervened. Others claimed it was the work of a secret hero, a warrior of such renown that even his name had to be kept hidden. A few whispered of a being from beyond the world, a force of pure destruction that had answered some unknown call and done what needed doing before vanishing forever. All of these stories were true, in their way, and all of them were incomplete, because the truth was simpler and more terrible than any myth. The Doomslayer had come, had seen corruption, and had destroyed it, not for glory, not for reward, not even for gratitude. He had done it because that was what he was, and he would continue doing it in world after world, dimension after dimension, until either he was finally destroyed or there was nothing left to destroy. Eternal, unstoppable, silent. And in dimensions far from Middle-earth, in the endless corridors of hell and the contested spaces between realities, demons would whisper of a world that had called him, and of what he had done there. They would add it to the long list of reasons why the Doomslayer was to be feared above all things, why his coming meant only one thing: the end. The end of corruption, the end of malice, the end of dominion. Just the end. And in the deep places of the world, in caverns where even the memory of sunlight had never reached, things that had served Morgoth and Sauron and older powers still stirred. They felt the cleansing that had swept through Mordor. They felt the presence that had caused it, and they burrowed deeper, hoping that by hiding well enough, by being small and quiet enough, they might be overlooked when that presence returned. Because they knew, as all corrupt things know in their hearts, that it would return, not to Middle-earth, perhaps, not in their lifetimes, probably. But somewhere, sometime, the Doomslayer would emerge from another rift, see corruption that needed purging, and begin walking forward, and nothing, not gods or demons or the fundamental laws of reality itself, would be able to stop him. That was his curse. That was his purpose. That was his eternal war. And Middle-earth, having witnessed just one battle in that war, counted itself lucky to have survived the experience unchanged, unknowing that in other worlds, in other dimensions, the war continued. As it always had, as it always would, until the last demon fell, until the last corruption was burned away, until silence, true silence, finally fell across all the worlds,